Hello, everyone. Hello, Hong Kong. And greetings from California. We're here at the California Wine Institute's San Francisco office and beaming to you from here. We're lucky to have some good technical help from Shin Kao, who's our technical guy and who's done all the work to set this up. It's really great to be here with you all virtually. Obviously, we'd prefer to be there in person, but it's good to be able to do this and share the same wines together and talk about them. Let me just talk for a minute about how this all came about and what we hope to achieve, and then kind of what the second and third part of this might be. So we had planned to do a number of tastings and events in Hong Kong over the past year. And because of COVID, none of those things came to pass. But optimistically, we had shipped wines already to Hong Kong. And so we were brainstorming a bit about, well, how can we do something to utilize those wines and to achieve, the goals that we had set out initially for the tastings. And we thought, well, maybe we can do virtual tasting, not just a virtual tasting, but a seminar. And so that's how this came about. So this is the first of three. We're doing this one on reds. We're going to do one on whites, and then we're going to do one on rosés. And we were very lucky. I talked to Elaine Brown, who's a good friend, and not only of me, but of the Wine Institute, and asked her if she might be willing to help out, to lead these seminars and tastings, and she agreed, which we appreciate very much. I'll introduce her in a second, and actually what she will do is kind of go through exactly how this seminar and tasting today will go. So Elaine has a very interesting background. She's originally from Alaska. She came from the fishing industry, and then was an academic for many years, and developed a great love and interest in wine, and became really a wine expert, over a decade ago. She's the North American specialist for Jancis Robinson. She's one of the authors of the North American section of the Oxford Companion to Wine and the World Atlas to Wine. Just this year, she was named Wine Communicator of the Year by IWSC and Vin Italy. She also was named by Wine Business Monthly the North American Leader this past year. And in 2019, Wine Industry Network named her one of the most inspiring people in wine. And I think that if you've been in one of Elaine's seminars, you can appreciate what a good communicator she is, what a good educator she is. And not only does she educate, but she brings entertainment and animation to the process of trying wines, which can become very dull and boring if you do it all the time. So we're thrilled to have Elaine, and thank you very much for joining us. Thank you for that. The other thing I want to make a comment about is we are very sensitive to what's going on in the world with COVID. And you see that Elaine and I are sitting a few feet from each other without masks. And the reason for that is that both of us have been vaccinated. So we're still being conscious and careful and following the protocols, but I just wanted to make that point so you don't think that we're just throwing caution to the wind here. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Elaine. This is going to be somewhat interactive, but it's really her show. And maybe you can just kind of describe what we're going to do today.
Yes, thank you so much. I want to say, first of all, that I am so honored to be able to be with you today and to present with all of you today. One of my favorite places to visit is Hong Kong. And I have to tell you as well that the school that you are in today, I have so much admiration and respect for. What they have accomplished is really quite impressive and important. And I'm grateful to be able to be part of their work by offering this seminar for all of you today. We do very much want to encourage questions. And so please do feel free to raise your hand or to indicate that you have a question, and the team there will help us understand what it is you're hoping to learn more about and to answer those today. Christopher and I are going to present together. I very much appreciate the work that Christopher has done for a very long time, specifically on California wine, but also with all of you there in Hong Kong. And so I think it's very important to welcome his perspective as well. And so we will very much present together. And what we designed today, as he mentioned, this is the first of a series of seminars on California wines. So this one is on reds, and then we will present later in the year on whites and then on rosés, which are rosé is one of the exciting things that has been growing and developing in California. And it will be very fun to present on that later in the year when it's even warmer than it is for you there now. Today, though, what we're going to do is look at hallmark varieties of California. And so you have 10 wines in front of you, but you can think of them as 5 pairs of wines. And so we have 5 different varieties that each have a very important role in California. And the pairs altogether are meant to show a range of regions of California, as well as a range of styles and price points. And so we'll talk about that as we go, because some of the pairs, they have very contrasting wines of the same variety. Some have very comparable wines of the same variety, but from very different regions. And so the idea is that in all 10 wines, you'll get a nice overview of some of the really signature red varieties of the state. And so we sort of start lightest and build from there. And again, we'll talk today about some of the historical importance, the stylistic variation, trends that are emerging, and also different regional characteristics as we go. That's good. Yeah.
That's perfect. Sounds perfect.
Okay.
By the way, just one other thing I wanted to mention before we get going. I also want to thank Beatrice Ng and Sally Cheng in Hong Kong. They do such a great job there, and I really appreciate everything that they've done in organizing this on your end of the world. So I just wanted to mention that as we get going.
No, please. And again, if you have questions, Beatrice and Sally are there to help us understand your questions and to help us answer them. So please do feel free to raise your hand and let us know what you're wanting to understand as we go along, because this seminar very much is for each of you. So we're going to start with Pinot Noir. And before we do that, though, I'd also like to thank Katie Canfield. She's done an incredible job making a series of maps for us, as well as wine slides that we'll use throughout the webinar. And she's doing the screen sharing behind the scenes. It's actually a little bit challenging to do. And so I very much appreciate her willingness to help us tonight. We have a little team of people that's really made this possible. So Katie, if we could just start with the very first slide, that's just the kind of an overview of California. It'll help us get situated and start the conversation, understanding growing regions of the state. So the lower left-hand corner, you can see there's a little white outline of the state of California as a whole. And there's a little orange box over the outline of the state. And that orange box shows you, we've zoomed in a little bit to see a little slightly smaller region of California. So what you're able to see here is basically a satellite photograph of the state of California that was taken from Google Earth. And what it really shows you is up there in the top left, the yellow outline gives you a glimpse of the North Coast AVA. It's quite a large area of California. The North Coast AVA, as Katie's outlining with the red pointer now, includes at the very top, Mendocino County, Lake County, and then also Sonoma County and Napa Valley, and Marin County as well. We're going to talk today about some of those areas, Napa Valley and parts of Sonoma County especially. And then it's not outlined, but if you follow the coast south, you can see there's San Francisco, of course, and then all the way from San Francisco all the way down to the bottom of Santa Barbara County below Santa Maria Valley. That whole long stretch of the state is known as the Central Coast of California. And the Central Coast is quite a large area. It is its own recognized AVA, and it's an incredibly complex region, a part of the state. If you were to drive from the very top of the North Coast AVA to San Francisco, it would be, I would say, probably about 5-hour drive at least.
Maybe a little bit less than that, but about 4 hours for sure.
And if you were to drive from San Francisco all the way to the bottom of Santa Maria Valley, I'd say that'd be about 6 or 6.5 hours.
Yeah, that's about
Yeah.
right.
So just to give you a sense of how long these areas are, it covers quite a bit of the state. And so one of the really important things to understand, though, is you can see, of course, that the whole western length of the state of California is bordered by the Pacific Ocean. And the really important thing to understand is that there is a powerful ocean current. It's one of the strongest ocean currents in the world that borders the entire west coast of California. And it's not only a strong current, it's also one of the coldest currents in the world. So there's an incredibly cold ocean current. It starts way, way out in the Pacific Ocean near Hawaii and goes all the way up north to the southern part of Alaska, which is where I'm from, as Christopher mentioned. And it cools down quite a bit as it goes by Alaska. And then it sweeps past Western Canada, past the state of Washington, Oregon, and then almost the full length of California. And so the entire coastal region of California, the North Coast and the Central Coast of California, are actually incredibly cold. A lot of famous movies, a lot of famous TV shows, they show palm trees, people in swimsuits on the beach. They're all down in LA.
Or San Diego.
Or San Diego. There are not vines in LA or San Diego. All the vines are growing further north where the cold ocean current keeps temperatures quite chilly. And so our conversations will be focused on those areas. So the first two wines, the first pair that we're going to look at is Pinot Noir. And what we've done with each pair of wines is we've picked a wine, again, at contrasting styles, contrasting price points, and contrasting regions. And so the first pair is Pinot Noir. And again, Katie has made a beautiful satellite photo map here that shows the two parts of California that the first two wines come from. So you can see the very first wine is from Starmont. The Maryvale Winery is in the northern part of Napa Valley, but Maryvale makes a collection of Pinot Noir wines under their Starmont label. And the Starmont wines come from the Napa Valley side of the Carneros AVA. And so this very first wine is grown in Carneros.
You know, Elaine, if I could interrupt
Yes,
you
please.
For a second about Carneros, because Carneros is very interesting. You notice that Elaine talked about the Napa side of Carneros. Carneros is one of those unique AVAs that's split. It's, part of it is in Sonoma and part of it's in Napa. So I think it's good to make that distinction.
Yes, absolutely. So most AVAs in the state of California fall within one political boundary that we call a county. And so it's actually possible to name the appellation that your wine is from in the United States as the county in which it's grown. But a county is a political boundary. And then we also have climate and soil designations, appellations that are defined by climate or soil. So Carneros is a unique AVA or a unique appellation in that it is actually the first AVA in the United States that was defined specifically by its unique climate. So it was actually, the Carneros AVA was created in the 1980s. And before Carneros AVA was created, the other AVAs that were made in the state of California were based on political boundaries of areas. So the very first AVA in California was Napa Valley, and it circumscribes the kind of recognized geography of Napa Valley. Carneros instead created an outline based on its uniquely cool, fog-laden growing area that is very much influenced by the bay, San Pablo Bay that falls below it. But because it's defined by climate, it actually crosses over two different counties. Half of the Carneros AVA is in Sonoma County, and we'll look at a wine that's from the Sonoma side of Carneros later. And half of Carneros AVA is in Napa County. And so this first wine is actually from the Napa side of Carneros AVA, which is what Christopher was highlighting. The second Pinot Noir that we have is from very, very, very far south. So while the first one is from inside the North Coast in the Carneros AVA, the second one is all the way down at the bottom of the Central Coast in the Santa Maria Valley AVA, as Katie is highlighting there. And so the second wine is made by Dierberg. They are, importantly, they're contrasting price points. The Star is meant to be relatively affordable, to really show and hallmark the characteristics of Carneros. Dierberg is meant to really celebrate a single vineyard Pinot Noir and really showcase the characteristics of that specific vineyard. They have basically the same percentage of new oak influencing the two of them. They both have a real complex of Pinot Noir clones behind them. So neither focuses only on one clone. Instead, they really feature and celebrate a real mix of clones. And they both have really loamy soils. The Carneros side has more clay. The Dierberg side has more loam. So let's go ahead and taste the wines. And I'd love to hear what what stands out for Christopher on both of them.
They're good. I think the interesting, because Carneros has this reputation for kind of having this cherry cola characteristic, which I don't know if that translates well in Hong Kong, but there's Coca-Cola, and then we've always in the US also had cherry cola, which is cherry flavored Coca-Cola. And they say that the Carneros region in particular has this sort of cherry cola characteristic to it. And I think that comes through in this wine. I think you do get that. It's definitely fruity. I don't see as many layers as you get in the Dierberg, but it's got pronounced fruit. I
think for me, the Starmont is very pleasant. That cherry note is very apparent. I don't know that this translates either, but sarsaparilla is another.
Right. Yeah.
Sometimes people talk about cola. Sarsaparilla is a root that has this kind of sweet, pungent quality, and I noticed that here as well. But the thing about the Dierberg is there's more pronounced aromatics for me, and really a kind of tonal range of fruits. So I get like high and bright red fruits, and then deeper toned red fruits. There's more layers for me as well.
And you get a little bit of a kind of a sage or something like that, something a little more herbal, but it's not unappealing. It's as you say, it's just more aromatic.
Mm-hmm. Again, this is a contrasting pair. They're kind of similar mix of clonal material in the vineyards. Similar enough soils, comparatively similar temperatures for the growing conditions. They're in the same vintage, but they're from very different parts of the state. And they're also intentionally made to be different price points and so styles in that sense. So again, the Dierberg is meant to be a slightly more elevated single vineyard expression of Pinot that really is meant to capture the characteristics of its region. And the Starmont is meant to kind of showcase the regionality of Carneros, but in a very approachable, affordable manner. It's a little challenging to ask for perspective from any of you there, but if it's possible, I would love to get a sense of how the wine stands out to any of you, if any of you feel comfortable speaking up. If you don't with this first pair, just please keep in mind that we would love to hear from you if you have comments about the wines as we taste as well. So please feel free to raise your hand if you do want to speak up. And while you consider that, I'll let you know. So Pinot Noir has actually been in California since the late 1800s. We actually, many varieties, we do know when they arrived. We're actually a little unsure about when Pinot Noir arrived in California. We do know it came in the 1800s, but it just sort of suddenly was here and already growing. And so we don't have a record for the exact date that it arrived, but we know that by the end of the 1800s, people were taking it very seriously, especially in Livermore and the Santa Cruz Mountains areas. Producers were really invested in trying to make excellent Pinot Noir. As time has gone on, Pinot has really taken hold mainly in the very coastal parts of California, where there's a lot of fog influence and a little bit of wind that helps extend the growing season and keep that natural acidity up. The other thing that really stands out for me in these two wines is that they're very mouth-watering. So the flavors are very different between the two. The textures are a little bit different as well, but they both have like really very long finish and mouth-watering, very mouth-watering experience there.
The other thing I'd say about Pinot Noir is that it is a grape that it's good to showcase the different parts of California, because Pinot Noir is grown in many different parts of California, and each style is different. Elaine and I were talking about this earlier. So, for example, not just to rattle off all the places, but you have Anderson Valley, you have Sonoma Coast, you have Russian River, Carneros, Santa Lucia Highlands, Santa Rita Hills, Santa Barbara. So there are all these different parts of California that produce Pinot Noir that's all a little bit different. So you have a lot of variety. The other thing I'll say about Pinot is it was really the movie Sideways, which had it sounds kind of hard to believe, but it had a pronounced impact on the cultivation and development of the Pinot Noir grape varietal in California. It was really, I would say, a minor varietal prior to the movie Sideways coming out, but that movie had such a pronounced impact on the market, on consumers, that a lot of wineries started to look for other places to grow Pinot Noir, and it really took off. So it's a very important variety now in California.
And it, in many ways, Pinot, as Christopher was saying, it really speaks to the places that it's grown, and it's grown in so many different parts of California that Pinot is one of the varieties that you can really taste to get a sense of what the growing conditions are like, because it shows up so differently in different places. So that movie that Christopher mentioned, it was released in 2004, and leading up to, prior to the release of that movie, both Syrah, which we are not tasting today, but Syrah and then Merlot, which we'll taste next, they were actually very important varieties and growing in importance in the state. And then in 2004, when the movie Sideways came out, both Syrah and Merlot took a huge crash. People turned their interest away from those varieties, and many of the places that they had been planted, people pulled out and planted Pinot instead. And so, so that movie, one movie, actually had a huge impact on the kind of varietal makeup of the state. Mm-hmm. So with that in mind, let's look at Merlot, because Merlot is actually a variety that does very well in California, but has had a very troubled history, interestingly enough. It's always held a sort of background important position. So Merlot has really been here all along. So the third and the fourth wines, please feel free to taste them as we talk about them. But Merlot has been here since the 1800s and has been considered one of the sort of stalwart or long-standing varieties in the state. But at the same time, it's never really had its celebrated moment. It has, as I said, it's been here since the 1800s. Single varietal Merlot did not start to appear in California until the 1980s. So there was a very brief period where people were especially interested in Merlot in the 1980s and going into the 1990s. And it looked like it was going to continue to grow until, again, this movie came out and people turned their attention away from Merlot and instead towards Pinot instead. But that said, Merlot has continued to be important as a variety to blend, most especially with Cabernet. Merlot does a really nice job at really filling in kind of the middle of the mouth and giving a sense of roundness and body to wines. And so it has kind of continued to have some sort of role in California, but never really the most celebrated one. So if we could go ahead and see the map that Katie's created for the Merlot pair, that would be great. So again, we have picked two wines here that are from very different parts of the state. So we have now, we just looked at wine from the Napa side of Carneros. And now what we're looking at is first a Merlot, and the third wine from Sonoma Valley. And actually this part of Sonoma Valley grows on its, this part of Sonoma Valley actually overlaps the Carneros, the Sonoma side of Carneros. So this vineyard is in a very interesting position where two appellations actually overlap. So we have the Sonoma side of Carneros overlapping the Sonoma Valley AVA. And this wine is not labeled as Carneros because a little bit of the fruit also comes from another appellation called Moon Mountain. And both the Sonoma side of Carneros and Moon Mountain fall within the larger Sonoma Valley AVA. And so they've labeled it as that. The Shug Winery that has made this Merlot is actually, it's a very unique and family-owned winery for Northern California. It has just celebrated its 40th anniversary. The family is German-American and really reaches back to like kind of old history of California. So California in the late 1800s was very importantly influenced by a lot of immigrants from Italy. But before that period, in the mid 1800s, quite a few immigrants came over from Austria and Germany, and they were actually some of the first to establish vines in California, and then the Italians came after that. And so Shug really kind of connects with that very old history of California. And then the second wine, the second Merlot, is from J-Lor there in Paso Robles. J-Lor, again, is a family-owned winery. Both Shug and J-Lor are second-generation family-owned wineries. J-Lor has been established for more than 50 years, and in fact was one of the first wineries to really help to showcase that the Central Coast, and especially this area of California, really could do very, very well making wine. And so just like the first pair, we have a contrasting pair here in terms of value. Shug is meant to really showcase the kind of finesse and gravitas of the Sonoma Valley area. And the J-Lor is meant to celebrate approachability and drinkability for Paso Robles. Paso Robles is warmer in comparison to Sonoma Valley. It likes to really showcase its full mouth expression of flavor, lots of fruits and kind of warmer tones or darker tones. So let's go ahead and look at wines 3 and 4.
You know, if I could for a minute talk about Paso, or maybe we should talk about the wines first, and then we can talk about Paso. So, what do you think? What do you think of these two wines?
Well, so something that I will point out is that each of these wines has some American oak. Mm-hmm. I feel like it does show up distinctively in the two wines. The J-Lor actually has 18% new American oak, so it's meant to kind of have a little bit more of a marker there. Whereas the Shug, the first of the pair, has French oak and American, but I still feel like I can smell a bit of that kind of green,
For sure.
herbaceous quality
Yep.
from the American oak. And to have that on Merlot is pretty unique for wine. So that's one of the things that really stands out to me.
I almost feel like I taste more American oak in the Shug than I do in
I
the
was
Loire.
thinking that as well, but I'm surprised by it because it actually, there's more American oak in the J. Loire, but I feel like it shows up more in the Shug. You'll also notice that the J. Loire is predominantly Merlot. It's 83% Merlot, but as Katie's showing in the wine slide right now, there's some Malbec and some Cabernet Sauvignon as well. They have some essentially the same alcohol level. The Shug was actually aged 24 months, and it has 20% new oak, but it's new French oak. It was the Shug would also include some Hungarian and some American oak. The J. Loire was aged for 12 months in barrel with 18% new American, no French and Hungarian.
You know, one thing I'll say is that even though they're different price points, I think both producers are representative of producers that kind of over deliver in terms of the quality for the price point. I think you could say that about Shug or J. Loire. They're both that way.
Yeah, I agree. And again, they both have that really nice mouthwatering finish. Like really, I think very like succulent, supple tannin. So there is structure there. You know, there was structure in the Pinot, but like very approachable structure. But then at the same time, again, very, very mouthwatering, really lengthy. Like my mouth is still watering now from having tasted both those wines.
I think Merlot is one of those varietals that's somehow gotten a little bit lost in the shuffle. You know, they're beautiful wines. It's a great varietal. It does so well in California. But when people think of red wine from California, they don't really think of Merlot. They think of Cab or Pinot or maybe Zinfandel, but they don't sort of initially think of Merlot. And it's kind of a shame because I don't think people are drinking as much of it as they were in the past. And it's a beautiful wine. It's a beautiful varietal, and it does extremely well in California. The other comment I wanted to make is about Paso, if I could, because Paso Robles is an area that a lot of people may not be as familiar with as they might be with, say, Sonoma or Napa. But Paso Robles is a very, very interesting and unique area. There's 7 sub-AVAs, so it's a fairly large area that goes all the way from the ocean to inland to the east side of Highway 101, which kind of comes down. So it has parts of the AVA are cooler, and then there are parts of it that are very, very hot. And one thing about Paso Robles is it can grow a lot of different grape varietals very well. One that I think it's like doing an amazing job is Rhone varietals. I mean, it grows some just amazing Rhone varietals. I think of Tablas Creek and some of the other folks that are doing Rhone varietal wines from Paso. Seems to be the right terroir for that.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And actually, Katie, if you don't mind pulling the Merlot map up again, we can talk a little bit more about what Christopher is getting at with the kind of contrasting growing conditions. It's a really interesting region in that if you just even look at just the topography that's visible from the satellite photo here, you can see that on the far left side of the Paso Robles AVA, that again, it's highlighted in that bright blue or turquoise color there towards the bottom. You'll notice on the left, very far left side of the Paso Robles AVA, there are really dark green sections. Those dark green sections are the coastal mountains of California. And so the far western parts of Paso Robles are fully tucked into high elevation, and we'll talk about this a little bit in the next pair of wines, but the far western sides of Paso Robles, very high elevation, steep sloped hillsides and canyons from the coastal mountains. And that side of Paso Robles actually has some of that cold ocean influence that we've talked about because the canyons that I mentioned often kind of wind around and open up facing the ocean. And so pull in some of that cold ocean influence and really chill down the mountainside of Paso Robles. But you'll notice that that entire eastern 2/3 of Paso Robles that's outlined there with the AVA, it's actually like really tan, open landscape. And that's because it's actually the entire eastern half of Paso Robles is a big, wide, open, flat plain of land. And it's far more exposed and really affected by rising daytime temperatures. So that entire eastern half of Paso Robles is really quite warm and very exposed, and so has much warmer temperatures, and so creates much riper, fuller bodied wines. Whereas the western mountains of Paso Robles, the wines have a lot of tension and a lot of natural acidity, and you see really fantastic Syrah and Grenache, especially growing in those coastal mountains, as Christopher mentioned.
It's really interesting soils too. I mean, in like the Taos Creek, all that, the soil types that they have there and their dry farming, it's a very interesting area, and one that's just now, I think, starting to get a lot more visibility. It's been sort of, I wouldn't say ignored, but it hasn't gotten, I think, the respect that it deserves as a region until the last few years.
There's a lot of complexity there, and really some really interesting growing conditions. And I think we can actually, we're going to keep talking about Paso Robles with the next pair of wines, and we might as well continue to do that because it gives us a chance to get into some of the soil complexity that Christopher was mentioning. So looking at wines 5 and 6, we now have a pair of Cabernet Sauvignon. And Cabernet, of course, is today really California's most famous variety. We are only talking about reds today, but Chardonnay is actually the most planted variety in California, but very, very close to it. Cabernet Sauvignon is very, very planted as well. And the two are consistently the first and second most planted in the state. Cabernet Sauvignon, though, however, it did arrive in the 1800s, as I've mentioned, with several other varieties. But until the 1980s, it did not have a very strong, there were not very many acres of it planted anywhere. It was actually, Cabernet Sauvignon is very expensive to farm and to grow. It takes a lot of attention in the vineyard. The yields are quite a bit lower than many other varieties. And that's just common for many fine wine varieties have lower yields and also take more attention in the vineyard, which means they're more expensive to grow. And so then, even though Cabernet arrived in the 1800s, until the 1960s, there was very little acreage of Cabernet present in the state. It did start to grow in the 1960s. And then by the 1980s, people were getting very, very excited about Cabernet. But in Napa Valley, of course, is California's most famous region, and it is most famous for Cabernet Sauvignon. It was not until 1997 that Cabernet Sauvignon became the most planted variety in Napa Valley. So even though Cabernet today from California is very famous, it's very recent that it became as common as it is today. So if we could go ahead and look at the map, we can talk about different growing regions of California in relation to Cabernet. Now, Antica is a very special wine. It's very special that we're able to showcase it for you today and to share this particular bottling. The Antica that we have today is their Mountain Select Cabernet, and the Antica is actually quite a very, very special winery, and it is special because it actually is owned and originated by the Antinori family of Italy, who have been farming for more than 630 years. There's something like, I think it's 26 generations of farming family with Antinoris. And so the name Antica comes from combining their family name Antinori with the word California. So Antica is Antinori in California. They were able to purchase this particular property in 1993, but it's an incredibly high elevation property in what we call the Atlas Peak area of Napa Valley. And the vineyard actually reaches 2,700 feet. Oh, do you have a sense of meters for that? I forgot to translate to meters. Please forgive me.
Almost 1,000 meters.
So it's incredibly high elevation, far up into the mountains, entirely volcanic soils in this area. And the Antinori family is farming Cabernet all at high elevation in the mountains, as I said, and they take only 15% of their vineyard to create this particular wine that they call the Mountain Select. So they're very particular. They want this wine to be very special and to really showcase what the vineyard can do. And so that is the Antica Mountain Select Cabernet. Now, a very different area. We were talking about Paso Robles earlier, and so the other Cabernet that we have to share with you is from Dow, which is again a family-owned property in Paso Robles. But Christopher mentioned the different growing conditions of Paso Robles. Dow is in the coastal mountains, but on the eastern facing slopes of the coastal mountains. So they're in a very interesting position in that they are tucked against the mountains of Paso Robles, and so do have ocean influence, but they're facing that wide open plain at the same time. So they're in a unique position to receive enough warmth to ripen Cabernet. If you were further west, it would probably not be warm enough to ripen Cabernet, but they are just far enough east to ripen Cabernet, and yet still have very cold ocean influence to retain acidity at the same time. They are also very high elevation. This particular vineyard is around 2,200 feet. So they're the Antica and the Dow are very similar elevation that the vines are growing in. They're both predominantly Cabernet. The Antica has a little bit of Cabernet Franc, but they're both almost entirely Cabernet as well. But the Antica is entirely volcanic soils, and quite uniquely, which, as Christopher mentioned, Paso Robles has very unusual soils for the state of California. And the Dow vineyard actually has calcareous rock or uplifted limestone seabed. So there's actually parts of California have limestone, but the limestone tends to appear in warmer areas of the state. And so this is a very unique case in which it's actually Cabernet grown in limestone, which in the world is very unusual to find. These two wines are, again, a contrast of price points, though. The Antica has been aged for 18 months, 15% new French oak. It's really meant to showcase kind of the elegance and might of mountain vineyards, whereas the Dow has been aged for 10 months. It has around 60% new French oak, and it's meant to be a little bit friendlier, a little bit more affordable, while still showing the seriousness of mountain farming.
I think that a lot of the Paso Robles cabs have this very distinctive jammy characteristic to them. I just see that over and over again. I'm not sure exactly what it's from, whether it's soil or whether it's the heat or what it is, but you get that in the Dow. Another, just a quick little vignette about Dow. So the Dow winery was only started in 2012 and by two brothers, George and Daniel Dow, who were originally from Lebanon. And they were living in Beirut as children, and their family got caught up in the Lebanese Civil War, and actually there was some injury that they were affected by, and so the family left Lebanon and went to France, where they developed a love of wine and so on. And then they found their way to San Diego or Southern California, where the two brothers, who are very close today and have always been both engineers, started a company, something in technology. They did very, very, very well with it. And then decided to follow their passion, which was developing a winery. And so they came to Paso and they looked for a place to develop the vineyards and so on, and they picked what they call Dow Mountain. And it is one of the most beautiful places I've ever seen of any winery. So if you have a chance to go there, you should visit it. But they've been incredibly successful in a short period of time. Only 2012 they started, and now their wines are very widely available. The other comment I wanted to make about Cabernet Sauvignon is it is, in Napa, which is the most famous wine region in California, it's the signature grape for Napa. And in Napa and California generally, again, there's just so much variety. If you just look at Napa, which is actually a very small region, 30 miles long, 7 miles wide in the widest spot, you still have, valley floor fruit like Oakville and Rutherford. You have benchlands, you have mountain fruit, and all of these areas are producing different Cabernet Sauvignon. So it's good. It's a fun wine because it's elegant and sophisticated, but then there's so many different types from California.
Christopher commented on the fruit character of Cabernet from Paso Robles. So what I would like to point out is that Paso Robles is really quite warm. It's an unusual area in that it gets very, very, very warm during the day and then quite cold at night. And so you have what's called a big diurnal shift, which is just a big temperature contrast between the peak temperatures during the day and then the lowest temperatures at night. The combination means that the flavors get very, very ripe, but the acidity stays present as well. But at the same time that it has these high daytime temperatures, it's also one of the driest parts of California. And so there's very little rainfall in Paso Robles. And I believe that part of what Christopher is getting at with that really pronounced more cooked or jam fruit that he finds in Paso Robles Cabernets, I think is characteristic of that combination of high temperatures and low rainfall. Mm-hmm. And so, whereas Napa, in comparison, while Napa does remain dry during the ripening season for Cabernet, it tends to get quite a bit more rainfall in the winter months, which means that going into the growing season, the vines are very healthy and ready to grow and set really healthy, prosperous fruit.
The other thing while we're talking about Cab that you should keep in mind is that Sonoma County also makes beautiful Cabernet. And because they're situated right next to Napa, I think it's natural for a lot of people to compare them. But I mean, Alexander Valley and Dry Creek and other parts of Sonoma make some absolutely, and Knights Valley make some absolutely beautiful Cabernet Sauvignon wines as well. We're not tasting any today, but look for them.
I'd also like to say that with the Antica Cabernet, I feel that again, this is mountain fruit. On Cabernet, mountain fruit tends to have more pronounced and chiseled or sharp tannin. But I feel that the extensive winemaking experience of the Antinori family really shows here in that there is absolutely plenty of tannin present in the Antica wine, but it's also, they have kept it very refined tannin. It's relatively approachable. There's plenty of structure, but it's a very refined structure.
Yeah.
So I think there's plenty of ageability with that wine, and yet it's a quite elegant tannin at the same time. The other thing to say about the Antica is that the 2017 vintage was kind of a record heat spell for Napa Valley. And so the fruit character of the Antica is darker than I tend to see from that particular wine, which is simply an example of it expressing the unique characteristics of the vintage.
Yeah, no, it is a dark wine, but it's beautiful. It's a very nice wine. Great food wine.
Well, and so before we continue, I'd like to invite any questions that we might have. We do have 4 more wines. We are going to talk about them, but I'd like to pause and invite any of you that might like to speak up to either comment on any wines that we've had so far, or perhaps there's some questions that you would like to ask. I know that we have a quite a sophisticated and curious audience of wine trade there. And I love having conversation about the wines. It's a little bit difficult because we're not actually in the room with you, but I do want to make a point of inviting you to speak up if you're comfortable.
Would anybody like to volunteer which wine they like the best so far? No? Come on.
I see some of you
Somebody
laughing
has
a
to
little
say, I
bit.
like this one or that one. It's okay. We won't put anybody on the spot. How about you? Which one did you like the most so far?
That's totally unfair.
If they're not going to answer, you're not going to answer. Okay, fair enough.
Yeah. So ha 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 ha. Okay, but honestly, any questions though about varieties or history, growing conditions, or winemaking so far?
You know, one thing I will.
think she
Oh,
has-
good. We have a question. Excellent.
I thought she did, so I was trying to encourage her.
Can you hear me clear right here? Can you hear?
Can you speak up just a little bit?
Or you can stand. Yeah.
So to be honest, I could see that you seemed to be eager to respond to things, and so I'm glad that you finally spoke up because
You can really see that far, like from.
I can see that
From the
far, and I
stage,
can see
yeah.
that you were thinking about things. So I'm glad you
I think
spoke up.
this is indeed very unique opportunity that we taste. Like you talk a little bit more about Paso Robles. I think it can be like really personal view, but I would like to ask like from all the wines or wineries that you have tasted from Paso Robles, what kind of variety that you might kind of hit your spot? So because actually we have tasted like Merlot and also the Cabernet Sauvignon, but like personally I feel the Cab so it's a little bit like classic. Do you feel or agree that like because of the various or the very diversified terroir in Paso Robles, indeed they can make a little bit more interesting characters from like some non-mainstream or like not that popular varietals like Merlot or even Pinot Noir. Like yeah, this is kind of interesting things I would like to know more from Paso Robles.
Great. No, that's great. Thank you so much for that. So we're all, we're not tasting white wines today, but I actually I think that, so again, this is my personal view, but my personal view is that some of the most exciting wines coming out of Paso Robles are high acid white varieties and different Rhone white varieties. So, you mentioned the idea of unusual varieties. Picpoul Blanc is not super well known, but Picpoul Blanc is one of the 18 recognized varieties of the Rhone Valley of Châteauneuf-du-Pape, and it's also its own appellation. Picpoul de Pinet is an appellation along the Mediterranean as well in the southernmost part of France. It's this very high acid white wine, and it does incredibly well in that coastal mountain part of Paso Robles. The other Rhone white varieties, Roussanne, in the coolest parts of Paso Robles, like again those mountain areas, Roussanne can be really incredibly delicious. Tablas Creek is one winery that does make Roussanne specifically, and also Roussanne blends. The thing about Rhone varieties is that their history really is about blending them together rather than only making one at a time. And again, that coastal mountain area makes really beautiful examples of Rhone blend wines. I really especially enjoy the white examples, but as Christopher mentioned, Syrah and Grenache do very, very well there as well. And since we've mentioned Tablas Creek, we're not tasting Tablas Creek today, but Tablas Creek has actually brought in all 18 recognized varieties of Châteauneuf-du-Pape into the United States and established them there at their winery in Paso Robles. It's quite exciting because it means we're discovering kind of new frontiers, new horizons for what California can grow and do well with. And so far, all of those varieties are succeeding in California, though at very small quantities. So again, high acid whites is what I'm most excited about. Picpoul, Grenache Blanc. Roussanne is not very high acid, but it does very well there. And then also, as Christopher mentioned, the Mourvedre actually, Mourvedre or Mataro as it's known from Spain, is a red Rhone variety that is excellent in Paso Robles. That would definitely be worth keeping an eye out for as well. Did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think, this in the same way that Napa has become synonymous with Cabernet Sauvignon, even though it grows, Napa, you can grow lots of different grape varieties very, very well, like Zinfandel, for example. Zinfandel grows phenomenally well in Napa, but nobody wants to grow it because you can do better with Cabernet Sauvignon. So Napa has become synonymous with Cabernet Sauvignon. I believe that if the consumer was more accepting of Rhone varietals and that there was greater demand for Rhone varietals, I believe that Paso Robles would become synonymous with Rhone varietal wines because they do so well there. And the thing about Tablas Creek is they're truly a pioneer in so many different ways, including dry farming and bringing, sheep and goats into the vineyards in the winter and so on and so forth. So they're doing some things that really are trailblazing, not only viticulture practices and sustainability, but also these grape varieties that before were not here.
Yeah, absolutely. There is a tiny little bit of Pinot Noir growing in Paso Robles, but it's and in fact the oldest Pinot Noir in the Central Coast is there in Paso Robles. It was planted in the 1950s, but it's one tiny little. There's this little chute canyon. It's this tight little canyon that pulls in very, very cold air from the ocean, and it blows right over this tiny little part of the hillside where they have the Pinot Noir planted. And so it's this tiny little cold pocket that is cool enough for Pinot. But Pinot, most of Paso Robles is too warm for Pinot. But again, those coastal mountains have a lot of texture and real differences in land formation. And so you can grow a lot of different varieties there. And as Christopher's mentioning, that those mountains also, the soil types are really quite unique. And the cooler temperatures plus the soils mean it's possible to dry farm in those areas, even though it's a drier part of California. There's, again, those mountains through there have quite a bit of limestone. And limestone does a little bit better at holding water for certain times of the year. So
the other thing is, I think, as you all know, since you're wine professionals, they always say that great wine is produced in beautiful places, and there's a lot of truth to that. But Paso Robles, if you have the chance to visit, is absolutely a gorgeous place. It's really has great natural beauty as well.
Okay, so we welcome more questions, but let's go ahead and taste the next set of wines. So as we mentioned, Cabernet Sauvignon, it has been here since the 1800s, but it did not become one of the state's most planted varieties until the end of the 1990s. And in fact, as I mentioned, in Napa Valley, Cabernet Sauvignon did not become the most planted variety until 1997. And in fact, before 1997, so from the 1800s all the way into the 1990s, the two most planted varieties in Napa Valley were Petite Syrah and Zinfandel. And Petite Syrah and Zinfandel are two of the historically most important varieties in the state of California. Zinfandel absolutely had a lead role in helping to form the character and quality of wine in the state. But until the 1970s, Zinfandel was never planted on its own. It was always planted in what we call a field blend style of vineyard, which means that other varieties were mixed into the vineyard alongside Zinfandel. And one of the most important varieties that was planted alongside Zinfandel was Petite Syrah. So Petite Syrah is known for very easily making a very big very tannic, very dark wine. And so we have two examples of Petit Syrah followed by two examples of Zinfandel. And again, we're trying to look at different parts of the state and how they show up in different areas. And so we have here the Petite Syrah map that Katie has created. You can see that we have Petite Syrah from just over the border, just slightly into Sonoma, and then also another one. So Buena Vista there is just into the Sonoma side, and then Cajote is kind of central eastern Napa Valley. And so Petite Syrah, as I mentioned, has historically been one of the most important varieties for the state of California, but in some ways, like Merlot, has never had its own lead role. Petite Syrah was brought in and established very much to support other varieties, especially Zinfandel. Interestingly, Petite Syrah was first established and it was intentionally developed in France, in southern France, in order to avoid mildew issues in France. France, of course, has rain all year long. California, on the other hand, only gets its rain in winter. And so in summer, when the vines are growing, the state is entirely dry. This is an advantage for wine growing because what that means is that we don't have to worry very much about mildew and rot of fruit, whereas France actually has to very actively spray and farm to avoid mildew or rot issues. And so Petite Syrah actually originated in the late 1800s in France as an attempt to avoid mildew growing during the growing season. But what happened was they accidentally created a cross where the cluster grows very, very tight, very, very tight, close berries. And so while they stopped getting mildew on the outside of the fruit, they instead started getting rot inside the cluster. And so it turned out they succeeded in creating an entirely new variety that makes very delicious wine, but that is entirely wrong for the climate of France. So very quickly, the person who created Petite Syrah said, oh, perhaps another part of the world could use this. And so a wine grower in California took cuttings and took the cuttings by boat to California and began selling it from his nursery all over the state of California. And it very quickly took hold, but again, as a support partner to Zinfandel. Petite Syrah brings a lot of structure. It brings very dark color, a lot of tannin, and very big, deep-toned flavor. And so it was not until the 1960s that people started to consider making Petite Syrah on its own. It's considered a wine that is a really powerful addition to blends. Again, it helps kind of give a little more kind of size and volume to something like Zinfandel. More recently, people have also started to blend it with Cabernet. Both wines are very structural, but Petite Syrah kind of fills the mouth a little bit more. And so it's actually quite unique for us to have these two wines, which are Petite Syrah on their own, really each one made to show off the full kind of size and character of the variety. So let's go ahead and taste these two wines. They also, again, are a kind of contrast in pricing. The Buena Vista is meant to be very affordable, very approachable. You'll notice there's a little bit of Cabernet and Zinfandel in the blend. Whereas the Cajote, on the other hand, is a little bit more expensive and really meant to showcase a very specific part of Napa Valley, more specific expression of the variety, and it is 100% Petite Syrah.
Just a comment about the two wineries, because they both have interesting histories. So Buena Vista is, I think it's the oldest winery in California, right?
In Sonoma County.
Sonoma County.
Mm-hmm.
But it's one of the oldest wineries in California, and it has a long and storied history. Quixote, which is very interesting, is actually owned by a Chinese company, and now that acquired it maybe a decade ago. But the positioning of it in Stag's Leap is really interesting because it's right next to Schaefer, It's kind of across the street from Pine Ridge, and also on the south side, Stag's Leap Wine Cellars. So it's in some really really incredible company, and it's a great pocket right there at the foot of the Vaca Range in Stag's Leap.
Yeah. So as Christopher mentioned, the Cajote is from the Stag's Leap district. The vineyard was originally planted in 1989. Entirely volcanic soils, really a distinctive part of Napa Valley. And again, this wine is meant to really capture and express the unique character of that growing region.
And the thing that's interesting about it to me is also that when you think about Petite Syrah, I think about heat. And yet Stag's Leap is not the hottest part of Napa Valley. In fact, it's got a little bit still of the San Pablo Bay influence, especially in the early part of the day. And yet it's a great wine.
Yeah. It's far enough north that it definitely gets the warmth to ripen the fruit, and then at the same time has this kind of steady, persistent afternoon breeze off of the San Pablo Bay that helps cool things down, as Christopher was mentioning. You want to tell me what jumps out to you about the two wines?
Well, I think on the Quixote, sometimes I think of Petite Syrah as like, it's just too much. It's so powerful. It's got so much mouthfeel. It's so concentrated in a sense, just out of the glass. But they're both pretty drinkable and pretty approachable, I think. Sometimes when I think of Petite Syrah, well, I'm only going to have one glass of that. But I could see drinking, a couple glasses of either one of these wines.
Well, the Buena Vista to me really shows off the kind of blue fruits of the varieties that are blended in with it, whereas the Cajote, it has the kind of really deep dark tones,
like that black currant kind of.
Yeah. But the tannin is almost melts in your mouth. Yeah. There's this sort of.
It has a softness to it, which you don't kind of expect.
Yeah. So it's interesting. For me, the Cajote is an interesting contrast because it has this incredible size of flavor, but then this real elegance of structure, like a melting tannin. And I think that juxtaposition or the contrast of those two things is really unique.
Petite Syrah is a little bit like Merlot. It's just one of those things that people don't think about that much, but it has a lot to offer and people should look for it.
Well, and it's kind of very slowly, quietly building and attention in California. There's a little bit more effort from producers to kind of showcase Petite Syrah on its own. And even there's more single vineyard Petite Syrahs that are starting to come out of California as well, from all over the state.
They ended up in a lot of field blends with Zin, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So the history of the variety is that it really, it did very well as a kind of second position or partner to Zinfandel.
Well, it's interesting. We're going to talk about Zinfandel in a minute, so maybe I'll save some comments for that about field blends and Petite Syrah with Zin.
Yeah. Well, so let's go ahead and talk about Zinfandel then. And we want to allow a little bit of time too for other questions and comments as well.
Because we know you all are going to have a lot of questions.
So let's go ahead and, Katie, let's go ahead and see the Zinfandel map for these two wines. The last pair that we've created for you really show off two of California's most iconic wineries. So the first wine comes from the Louis Martini Winery. You can see where the winery is located there, right in the heart of Napa Valley, in the St. Helena area. This particular wine, though, the fruit actually comes from Moon Mountain, which you might remember was mentioned briefly in relation to the first Merlot that we had from Shug. And so you'll see that where Katie is highlighting that area of Sonoma, the eastern side of Sonoma, actually, kind of closer to the A there. So at high elevation, in the same mountain range that Napa has made famous, the Zinfandel vineyard for this first Zinfandel, the Martini, is actually grown there on the Sonoma side of the same mountain range that Napa's made famous. And so it's high elevation, very old vines. The vineyard that it's from is known as the Monte Rosso vineyard. And the vineyard itself was actually planted in the 1880s. And the oldest Zinfandel in this vineyard actually is still intact from the 1880s. The Louis Martini Winery purchased the vineyard in 1933 and has owned it ever since. And so it's actually quite special to have a wine like this that sources fruit from these very old vines of California. The wine is aged for 16 months. It has both French and American oak. So again, it's unique in that it does have American oak, but in this case, alongside French oak, a little bit of new oak from both of them. The Ridge Vineyard so this is the Louis Martini wine. So this particular wine is entirely Zinfandel, again, Monte Rosso vineyard. And then if we look at the second Zinfandel, again, a very iconic winery for California. Ridge Vineyards, of course, was founded at the end of the 1950s and helped make both California Cabernet and California Zinfandel famous. So we have here an example of their Zinfandel. They are known for making wines, most especially from both the Santa Cruz Mountains and Sonoma County. And in this case, we have their East Bench Zinfandel, which is from Dry Creek Valley, one of California's hallmark regions for Zinfandel. And so Zinfandel from Dry Creek Valley is really one of, that's really a signature variety for that particular region. These particular vines were planted in 1999, so they are younger than what we were discussing with Martini, and yet still have a fairly significant age on them. This is considered a single vineyard wine, again, 100% Zinfandel. In this case, the wine is entirely American oak, aged for 12 months with 10% new.
I should point out that Ridge, I think, also produces 3 different wines from Sonoma. They have the Geyserville, the East Bench, and the Lytton Springs. So one thing I really admire about Ridge is that their commitment to Zinfandel over a long period of time. Zinfandel is one of those varieties that has kind of gone in and out of fashion, if you want to think about it that way, and it actually has been a little bit out of fashion for a few years. And in the last couple of years, it's coming back into fashion. And a lot of producers are frustrated because they pulled all their Zin vines out to put Cabernet Sauvignon in, and now Zinfandel is coming back into popularity. So it's kind of interesting. But I really admire a lot of things about Ridge. And one of them is the commitment to the variety and also what they've done in Santa Cruz Mountains, because they are almost singularly responsible for the importance of the Santa Cruz Mountains as a wine growing region. In fact, in the repeat tastings of the Judgment of Paris, the Montebello Cabernet Sauvignon from Ridge consistently ranks number 1. It's kind of interesting how well that wine aged. We tried some. What was it, 84 earlier in the year, and it was incredible. It was intact completely, and so on. The other thing I wanted to mention about the Monte Rosso vineyard, it's such an important vineyard in California. Elaine had mentioned the history of it and the longevity of it. It has this deep red soil, I guess a lot of iron in the soil, and the Cabernet Sauvignon from the Monte Rosso vineyard, Martini Monte Rosso Cabernet Sauvignon, is incredible. So if you have the opportunity to try that, I'd highly recommend it. Very, very highly rated wine as well.
Yeah, so the soils at the Monte Rosso area, they're entirely volcanic, but again, as Christopher mentioned, really, really high iron content. And so the hillsides actually are this incredibly bright red-brown color because of the iron in the soils. As it's been exposed to oxygen, it has turned red. East Bench from Ridge, on the other hand, is sort of a mix of volcanics and sedimentary soils. And so it's a little bit contrasted in that sense. Again, Zinfandel is considered one of California's, signature varieties. The state has really, we now know, of course, that Zinfandel originates from Croatia. It very quickly did quite well in Italy as well, where it's related to Primitivo. But that said, California is really the region of the world that ended up showing how brilliantly Zinfandel can do, and has helped actually make the variety quite popular in Europe as well. It's emerged as one of the most popular varieties of across Scandinavia. And California really, by continuing to make Zinfandel, it was almost, it's a variety that was almost lost elsewhere in the world, but California continued to make it, and as a result has really shown the rest of the world how beautiful it can be, and helped reinvigorate the popularity of Primitivo in Italy, and the interest of both varieties across other parts of Europe as well.
The other thing I'd mention about Zinfandel is the stylistic differences. Zinfandel is one of those grapes that ripens unevenly. So you can actually, around harvest time, you can find clusters that have some even greenish colored grapes on it, and some that are even starting to look raisiny on the same cluster. And so wineries have to make a decision about exactly when to harvest. Do they want to have more berries that are ripe, or do they want to have, maybe a few more that are less ripe, where you're going to end up maybe with a little higher acid and so on. And so it's one of those grape varieties that style really plays into it a lot. So if you go to Lodi, we're not trying a Lodi-based Zinfandel. I encourage you to try one if you can, but the Lodi ones tend to be a little bit, I think, riper. I don't know if you agree with that as a general comment or not, but there's just a little bit of a different stylistic approach to, say, Dry Creek and the Sonoma County area.
Yeah, Zinfandel, a lot of us are familiar with the idea that Pinot is very expressive of the place it's grown, as Christopher mentioned, but actually Zinfandel is incredibly expressive of the place it's grown as well. And so it's really quite interesting to taste Zinfandel from around California and see how very different the styles turn out to be, because of it is expressing its regional growing conditions.
Before I was working for the Wine Institute, I was running a company in China, importing California wines to China. And when I first started the company, I thought that we would not sell any Zinfandel in Asia, because I thought, well, it's not a varietal that's well known. People know more the Bordeaux varietals or the Burgundian varietals, and Zinfandel is really unknown. And to my surprise, we sold more Zinfandel in China than any other varietal. And I found that so interesting, but it actually goes very, very well with full flavored foods. Maybe not in Hong Kong as much, but maybe so. But if you go to certain, pockets of different cuisine styles in China and other parts of Asia, the full flavors and so on go very well with Zinfandel. I found that just really interesting.
I think if I was going for hot pot, though, which is what I wish I was on my way to do.
The spicy one.
The spicy. Yeah, I think it would be interesting to try the Dierberg Pinot with hot pot. I actually am curious. I think if it was really spicy, the Quixote actually could be an interesting choice.
For sure.
Because it kind of has that structural presence to hold up to strong flavored foods. And I would be interested in the Ridge
for sure
as well. For hot pot, those would be my three choices. If we were doing something more like Shanghainese style cuisine, though, I would probably go ahead and even actually the Dao Cabernet, the Zinfandels would go really well with that more kind of the sticky, sticky
sweeter,
ribs. Yeah, this little bit of sweetness.
Yeah. How about you guys? What So we're getting
We have
close to the end.
we have a couple of minutes left. So if you
We're
have,
willing to stay over a little bit if you want us to, but the main thing is we want to give you all an opportunity to ask any questions that you may have.
yay.
Your friend Stephen.
Hello.
Oh, nice to meet you.
I have two questions. The first one is, how do the two Zinfandel wines differ in price? And then the second one is, how do they differ in the age of the vines?
Yes. So the Martini, the first of the Zinfandel wines, those vines, I believe, go back to the 1950s. Whereas the Ridge East Bench, so Ridge has different vineyards with different ages of vines. And in fact, Ridge, a different vineyard. So Christopher mentioned Geyserville. The Geyserville bottling includes some of the oldest Zinfandel in California. The East Bench, which we're having today, includes vines planted in 1999. So there's 35 or 40 year age difference in vines between the Martini Zinfandel and the Ridge Zinfandel. The Martini, I don't have Katie, could we go back to the wine slides because the prices in Hong Kong are on those two slides. The Martini is the more expensive of the two, but I want to be sure we have the prices for Hong Kong between those two. So
Wow.
the Martini is not quite twice as expensive as the Ridge. A little bit less than twice as expensive as the Ridge. So the Ridge is the less expensive of the two, but also younger vines of the two.
Well, I think Ridge is really interesting. I've seen their vineyard maps where they have, because they do field blends. So they'll show you, they'll be color coded. So all the Zinfandel vines will be one color, and then you'll see these other colors periodically that are Petit Syrah or another varietal that they blend with. It's pretty interesting.
Yeah. So the one thing though, because of when the East Bench was planted, it is only Zinfandel.
It's 100% Zinfandel.
Yeah.
Because Lytton Springs, I know.
Yeah. Lytton Springs and Geyserville are both very mixed, and those are field blend style plantings. But the blocks that Ridge planted in the 1990s are all single variety plantings. Does anybody else have questions or comments?
I want to make sure this is the last
Great.
questions from Reagan.
No, great. We welcome you.
Yeah, because I'm particularly interested in Zinfandel for many years, and this is quite interesting when you mentioned the ripeness of Zinfandel varies a lot, like amongst wineries, like for the house style. So what is the main trend of like the Zinfandel ripeness style in the market that you feel? Or you have mentioned that is quite popular in China. What is the main style that hits the main style of Zinfandel that's hit China? And I also note that Louis Martini, they have like significantly high ABV, like 16.1, which is like is better a lot. So how do you feel, like how will you comment about that for ripeness versus the winemaking decision? Like would that like affect a lot, or like would that be a trend to be high alcohol level of that style? Or if you can talk it.
Okay, great. So how about I'll comment on the trends that I see in California, and Christopher can comment on what is taking hold in the market in China. Does that sound right? Okay, great. So as Christopher mentioned, a Zinfandel cluster is quite unique. So because the way that Zinfandel tends to ripen is that just on one cluster, you'll have very, very ripe berries. You'll have dehydrated berries that have turned into raisins, and then you'll still also have underripe berries. Now, this is a particular challenge because underripe berries, they'll literally look green on the cluster, and they are incredibly acidic. But the thing is, those underripe green berries, they're not only high in acid, they actually taste sort of green and bitter because the fruit is not fully developed. And so there's a very underripe, bitter sort of flavor that will come from them. On the other hand, you'll also have berries that started to ripen early but now are so overripe that they've literally dehydrated, and they'll be like really black, dark raisins that have shriveled. And those also have a very distinctive flavor, and they taste like almost like dates, you know, kind of like how raisins can get really, really dark in flavor. Their Zinfandel raisins will get so dark they taste almost like dates, like they're very, very rich. And so when you're fermenting the wine, the proportion of green berries to raisins to perfectly ripe berries will dramatically influence the flavor of the cluster. Now, for producers that like to try to avoid those really dark raisin flavors, they'll focus on a lot of irrigation, and they'll try to just keep the fruit like really juicy through irrigation. At the same time that fruit is still ripening, it's just not drying out. So you're still getting riper and riper, higher alcohol from the wine. It's just you're avoiding the raisin flavors of dehydrated fruit. So the producer, what direction they go depends on which challenge they're more comfortable with. So if they're more comfortable with having higher alcohol, darker flavors, they'll go ahead and they'll pick later. If they're more comfortable with having lower alcohol, but some of the bitter flavors, then they'll pick earlier. And the thing about Zinfandel is you have to decide which challenge you're more comfortable with, because no matter what, you're going to have a challenge. Some producers decide it's worth the extra work, and they'll cut off whichever of the challenges they don't like. So they'll cut off the raisin berries, or they'll cut off the green berries. But that's so much extra work that it means it's incredibly expensive to make that wine. And so Christopher mentioned that Zinfandel really goes through periods of being popular and then periods of not being popular. If you're in a period where Zinfandel is not popular and it's very hard to sell the wine, then it's also really hard to justify the extra work of cutting off the fruit you don't like. So that said, we're in an interesting period where there are producers now who are very happy to make very, very light-bodied, low-alcohol Zinfandel that I have to admit tastes more green and more bitter as well. But a lot of people in the United States, at least, want that lower alcohol, lighter style, and so they're comfortable with that more green bitter flavor. So that's the challenge they're comfortable with. At exactly the same time, there are some producers like Martini who said, no, we've always made it this way with the darker flavors because we don't like the bitter flavors at all. So we wait until the fruit is fully ripe to get rid of those green bitter berries. And that means we have a higher alcohol wine, and that's okay. So right now, California has the full range of very green, less ripe Zinfandel and very dark, more ripe Zinfandel, and all the mix in between. There's just I would say there's the broadest range of styles of Zinfandel in the state right now that we've ever had. How that works in international markets, though, is really varied. And so I'm going to comment.
Well, yeah, I will. I mean, I think, to really make it overly simple, when I think about Zinfandel, I think about two general styles. There's what I call sort of the Dry Creek style, which is peppery, spicy. It's lean. It's a bit leaner. And then I think of another style, which is jammy, lower acid. Maybe you get a little bit of that date quality that Elaine was talking about, maybe even a little bit of prune kind of thing. I know that has a bad connotation, but maybe ripe plum is a better way of saying it, which is another style. And what I've noticed in Asia is that both styles are popular. People like both of them. They may not like them, everybody may not like both of them, but in general, I couldn't tell you that one is significantly more popular than the other. It's just something about the kind of the power that Zinfandel has that is very appealing in Asian markets.
And in some parts of Asia, like Singapore, for example, Rosé of Zinfandel is really has really taken off. Rosé of Zinfandel has become very popular. I noticed, especially in Singapore. I don't know if you're seeing that in other
Yeah,
areas.
yeah, no, it's all these rosés are taking off.
Yeah.
But it's interesting because, if you think about white Zinfandel, which some of you know Feng Walker in Beijing, and she always talks about white Zinfandel being a gateway drug. And by that, she means, it's a sweet kind of wine that is made in the 70s. Well, I guess it was late 70s, 80s, when white Zinfandel became popular because it had sugar in it, had residual sugar, and it was easy to drink and kind of a sweet wine. And it was and people would start drinking wine because they liked white Zinfandel. There are actually serious, what are now called rosés of Zinfandel, but in the old days it was white Zinfandel, but it had more residual sugar. So it's a grape that you can do a lot of different things with. And I think what we're going to see with this whole craze around rosés, so I think you're going to see some really serious rosés of Zinfandel coming out. I think there already are.
Yeah, people are starting to make it as in a dry style. So rosé of Zinfandel, but in a dry style, and also rosé of Zinfandel that actually can do well with aging, even. Which I take it as part of what Christopher means by serious rosé. Any other questions or comments that people have?
No questions?
Nothing?
Yeah. No. No. And I think it's about time for you to.
Yeah, we're okay.
I'm for that.
But if there are, so one last chance, nobody has another question.
Any questions from that area? No questions.
Okay. All right. Well, listen, I wanted to thank, first of all, thank you, Elaine. Thank you so much for doing this. Really appreciate it. And I wanted to thank Beatrice and Sally for organizing everything over there. I want to thank all of you for coming to the tasting and the seminar, and I hope you'll come back. And I hope as soon as I can get on a plane and come back to Hong Kong, I'll be able to meet all of you that I've not met before. And then I'd also really like to thank Shin, who's here and stayed dutifully and managed all of our technical things, as well as Katie Canfield, who's been behind the scenes up in Sonoma, pulling up the slides when we needed them and creating the slides and so on and so forth. So thank you all. What I always like to do at the end of these tastings, even if you don't tell us which wines you like the most, hold up whichever one you like, and we'll toast each other. Pick one up. There you go. All right. Cheers, and hope to see you soon in Hong Kong or here in California.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you for having
It's such an honor to be with you. Thank you.
Okay. Cheers.
Cheers.